I would like to get your attention for a moment. I recommend all participants to mute the audio and switch off your video during explanation from presenter to maintain good connection. And the presentation may be recorded for rescreening within the FOSI platforms. A Q&A box can be found in the icons panel, usually at the bottom of your screen. Enter your name for the committee to collate for after the presentation. It will be answered live by Dr. Uisdean later on. And you might turn on your audio or video to deliver your questions. Hope everybody happy with that. And to all participants, please enjoy your time on the talk. Without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Uisdean to deliver his presentation. Dr. Uisdean, time is yours.
Okay, many thanks, and thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. I think that was originally set up by Herman, who's obviously in close contact with and helps run things, and thank you, Ricky and Melinda, for the invitation. So yeah, as was just mentioned, the title of the talk today is Ocean Currents and Submarine Landslides. So looking at really at the links between, or the impact that currents have on modifying continental slopes and preconditioning those slopes for mass failure. The area that we're going to look at in detail was the subject of a paper, as was just mentioned, that we recently published, looking at the Makassar Strait, and specifically the impact of the Makassar through flow, which is kind of schematically shown in the background in this Google Earth image here, by the white line flowing from north to south through the Makassar Strait. So the work was done in a project last year together with, Rachel Brackenridge, who's at the University of Aberdeen now, did most of the technical work and was the main author in the presentation, in the paper, sorry. My colleague Doric Stowe from Heriot Watt, and then important contributions from one of our real landslide experts, who's done quite a lot of work in Indonesia. That's David Tappan from the British Geological Survey, and of course Benjamin Sapi, who's on the call with us today from ITB. So thank you to all my co-authors for your contributions. And I should also say that this work is ongoing, and there's now an expanded project team. And I'll mention that next phase of the project at the end. But what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to really give you, if I stay on this slide for a minute, I'm going to give you a kind of expanded introduction, really, that sets the context for this. So the motivation bit of this is of course, submarine landslides and their consequences, specifically their impact in terms of tsunamigenesis, forming tsunamis. And then the second part of this is the specific preconditioning mechanism that we're interested in, the factors that lead some slopes to be unstable. And we're going to look at the impact of bottom currents on slope stability, bottom currents and their depositional products, Contourites. So that's going to be a kind of two-part introduction. And then I'm going to take you to the Makassar Strait and look at the project that we recently worked on and are continuing to work on. So we're going to look at a little bit of the context in terms of the tsunami history of Indonesia. What are the main mechanisms? The initial hypothesis behind this original proposal, and that we tested during the course of the study, and some of the results and implications and further work. So the motivation, I think, is really fairly self-explanatory. This is an image from 2011 in Japan. This particular image is taken from Iwate Prefecture in Japan. And you can see here that this, of course, this was one of the most extreme examples that we have in the historic record of a major tsunami that really caused very significant damage. The other major one, of trans-ocean tsunami that had massive consequences in recent years was, of course, 2004 Aceh event. This particular event here, you can see that the tsunami is actually overtopping the seawall here, which is about 10 meters high. And the tsunami locally in this area reached heights of about 40 elevation. The wave height reached about 40 meters. So very significant. And so this isn't actually anywhere near the maximum wave height yet. This event was caused primarily, at least, by a magnitude 9 megathrust earthquake. So one of the 4 largest earthquakes of the last, during historic records, essentially. That ruptured a very significant. I don't know if you can see my mouse here. I might have to skip to get a laser on this, but you can see the surface rupture in the yellow line there on this image. And the Tohoku event's the largest one right in the middle of that. And that caused very significant surface rupture right along the trench of Japan, offshore Honshu. So really an unusually large event, but it caused a tsunami that significantly exceeded people's expectations. And this is, although not all as large as this event, of course, but this is the main mechanism by which large tsunamis are generated. So megathrust earthquakes at subduction zones. And you typically expect magnitudes of 8 or 8.5 or larger to generate significant tsunamis in these settings. I know that Indonesia uses slightly different cutoff for their tsunami warning systems, but this is the kind of, empirically, the largest tsunamis are generated by events of that kind of magnitude. But of course, that's not the only mechanism by which tsunamis can form. These form probably something in the order of 80% of historic tsunamis, but there are other mechanisms also that we have to be aware, that we have to think about. And among those, the most significant are landslides. So these can include coastal landslides, these can include flank collapse of volcanoes, these can include submarine landslides. And I'm going to focus on submarine landslides because they're sort of the hidden, they're really not obvious, and they're much harder to predict in terms of where they're going to occur than, for example, the flank collapse of volcanoes. So I'm going to focus a little bit on, I'm going to give you a few case studies that really brought these events to our attention as a scientific community and indeed to wider society. So the first of these is the Grand Banks event of 1929. This is a very famous event in the history of sedimentology because it was the first time that the turbidity currents had been kind of empirically observed directly in terms of their consequence. So this was a 1929 magnitude 7.2 earthquake, which was itself unusual and much larger than anything that had been observed before. This is a passive margin. This occurred offshore Newfoundland and Canada. So a passive margin, didn't really expect any large earthquakes, although they had a cluster of seismicity locally in that area before that. And it was unusual in a couple of respects. One in that it formed a tsunami. So even for an earthquake of this magnitude, they didn't expect a tsunami. And then the second thing was that there were multiple cable breaks associated with this. So cables extending across the Atlantic were broken in sequence after the earthquake. And it wasn't really until the 1950s that people recognized, after they started acquiring data from the seabed, bathymetry data from the seabed in particular, that they recognized that there was a submarine landslide associated with this event, and that it was, and you can see here the outline of that submarine landslide in the bottom right image here, the large slump. And it was, as that slump then transitioned into a turbidity current, that was the factor behind the cables that broke sequentially along the seabed. It wasn't really for another couple of decades into the early 1980s that people recognized, with the earliest generation of tsunami models, that people recognized that the submarine landslide itself was the reason behind the tsunami, the landslide generated the tsunami. Before that, it had been assumed that the earthquake had generated it. Second event is a much older event, but that was recognized in the late 1980s, and that was the Storegga landslide offshore Norway. So into the early 1980s, people started acquiring seabed data and seismic data off the coast of Norway, and they recognized that there had been a series of very large landslides, and one particular that was several thousand cubic kilometers of sediment volume that had occurred offshore Norway in relatively recent times. And at the same time, people recognized a series of tsunami deposits in Scotland. You can see here there from the blue dots, the location of recognized tsunami deposits, and also the amount of run-up calculated for these deposits. And they recognized, as they increasingly constrained the age of both these events, that one had formed the other. So the landslide had occurred around 8,200 years ago, and generated a large tsunami that inundated the coastlines, not just of the adjacent coastlines in Norway, but also the Faroes and Shetland, the coast of Scotland, and then even as far afield as Greenland. So a transoceanic event generated by a landslide. I actually live right on one of these blue dots here in Edinburgh. Not sure, again, if you can see my mouse, but if you know where Edinburgh is, you'll note that it corresponds to one of these blue dots. So, this is really a new, again, a kind of step forward in understanding that, again, in this location, we have passive margins. We don't have very significant seismicity, at least not now, and that these events could represent a serious, if infrequent, hazard, geohazard. The third event I wanted to mention was Papua New Guinea in 1998, and my co-author David Tappan was in the research team that surveyed this immediately after the event. So this was again a magnitude 7 earthquake, 7.1 in this case, and 20 minutes later, a very large tsunami, but very localized tsunami with very high frequencies, inundated the adjacent coastline. In this case, much more damage sustained to local villages, and really devastating impact on some of the local communities. So 2,300 people died during that event. The surveys, because the tsunami was quite unusual in its character, this was immediately surveyed afterwards. So new multibeam data was acquired, and some new seismic data was acquired, and those leading this research recognized that there was a large slump that formed at water depths of about 1 kilometer. Not a massive event feature. It was about 5 cubic kilometers, so quite a bit smaller than the Grand Banks and Storegga landslides, but still capable of generating a significant localized tsunami. So those are the three events that really put these in the not just the public attention, but also in the research community, recognizing that these kinds of events could be very, very dangerous. And so since then, 1998, there have been a number. Obviously, there have been more tsunamis than this. I've just put a list of events here which have some combination of tsunami forming mechanism or that are generated by landslides. So the ones in black here are those that are generated in part by submarine landslides. Actually, Palu is a bit of I'll come back to Palu later, but it's also coastal landslides in that case. Krakatoa is an example of volcanic flank collapse, so those are in red. And then purely subaerial landslides are shown in kind of greenish brown. You know that the greenish brown ones are predominantly at high latitudes in fjords and are really very localized, although very large tsunamis. I think I'll mention it on the next slide. A couple of significant events here. Tohoku is a bit controversial, but there is actually Dave Tappan, my co-author, wrote a paper shortly after the event suggesting that a landslide may have contributed to the largest amplitude waves in that scenario, in that example. Haiti is one where there are a number of landslides, relatively shallow landslides, that look like they contributed to that event. Java, potentially in 2006. But then retrospectively, looking back over the last few hundred years, over historic records, and people have gone back and surveyed some of these areas and looked for and tried to really understand what the mechanism was in many of these cases. And you can see that there's really quite a lot of events. Even if we just focus on the ones in grey and dark grey here, quite a lot of events that have a landslide component to them at least. Many of these, like Flores, 2 events in Flores in 1982 and 92 in Indonesia, Grand Banks, Puerto Rico, Messina, are generated by earthquakes. So typically magnitude 7 earthquakes or thereabout. There are a couple of them that are a bit more unusual. Lembata, 1979. You can see that this event was essentially, so far as we can see, spontaneous. So there was no meteorological event, no storm that changed the pressures in the sea, no large earthquake preceding this. So a relatively spontaneous landslide that still caused tsunami. And if we extend this still further back in time, we can see a couple of events here. Sorega, 8,200. Santorini, 3,600. This is a very significant event in the Mediterranean. This is a plant collapse or caldera collapse during eruption, Santorini, that looks like it contributed or may have contributed to the demise of the Minoan civilization in ancient Europe. But obviously a lot of data gaps here. There are clearly a lot more events in here based on the recent historic records, but that we just don't have direct evidence for. And I should say as well that these slides, that I may be missing some events in these slides, but this is the main events that I could find. If we go further back in time again, and you can see here there's a break in the time scale, and I'm going to switch to kind of a logarithmic time scale. We've got multiple mass transport deposits that have been measured and observed. So there are hundreds of these that are measured and observed around continental margins everywhere around the world, really. Some places more than others, and they're depending on sedimentation rates and slope configuration, etc. But of course, we don't have any record of impact for these events beyond the last 10 or 20,000 years, and that's because tsunami records are simply not preserved. Every time we have a glacial stage, every time sea levels drop 100 meters, we really erode any record of these events on shore. So very little in terms of preserved evidence for actual tsunamis associated with these. And it's not to say that all of these, what we know as so when I say mass transport deposit, I should define my term. Of course, that's usually, the term comes from seismic stratigraphic community. It really refers to the depositional products of submarine landslides observed in seismic reflection data. So you can see here in the image on the bottom right from a paper we published earlier this year that what these look like. And these are very often disintegrative flow, the debris flows, essentially very large debris flows that are preserved, but then freeze en masse, cohesive flows freeze en masse at the bottom of continental slopes. So because we don't have any record, we have first of all quite poor records of or age constraints on really the precise age of many of these events. We don't have records of their consequences. We don't really know too much about very often specifically what triggered them, but also and to a degree what preconditioned them. We can start to think about what preconditions these events, what causes the slope to be ready, to be primed for failure, using seismic reflection data and other data sets. And I'll talk about that more about that in a second. In terms of understanding their consequences, what we can do is we can model these landslides. This is an example from a paper that we published last year. This is using two sets of models here for this specific example here, actually from the Falklands. These are the Falkland Islands to the north here. This is the location of these submarine landslides. So what we've done in this model is we've reconstructed the landslide deposit from the basin floor onto the embayment from which they came, and then we run some numerical models looking at what their consequences are. So in this case, you can see what the landslide model looks like. I'm not really going to talk about that in detail. We can maybe discuss it later. And then we can use another model called Fun Wave TVD, but there are numerous models that do this to model the tsunami that forms as a result of such a landslide. So this is just a nice example of this, showing the wave propagating from a fairly large landslide, in this case, northward towards the Falkland Islands in this case. So we still have, though, some major questions. We can see that such landslides have tsunamigenic potential. Not all landslides, some of it really depends on the rate, the water depth, and the size of the landslide. Not all of them are likely to be tsunamigenic. But so we really need to understand when we do this kind of work what kind of process is involved. But what we can, one question that really stands out here is what are the preconditioning mechanisms that cause these? How can we start to build up a picture of where these are forming and why these are forming and what causes them to, what triggers their eventual collapse? So in this second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about preconditioning mechanisms. I'm going to talk about one specific set of preconditioning mechanisms that's relevant to the case study in the Makassar Strait, and that's to look at the influence of ocean currents. Okay, so the image in the picture here is a simulation of the Gulf Stream from NASA. Really, really nice simulation, and there's actually a video that shows this, but I decided to avoid video files if I could. But you can see here the Gulf Stream leaving just exiting the Caribbean between Florida and the Bahamas and flowing north and to the east initially along the continental slope of the US, and then moving across the Atlantic towards Europe, where it gives us this nice warm climate for a relatively high latitude. So obviously it transports heat, it transports water, and it forms a very important part of our global climate system. I'll speak a bit more about these shortly, but you can see here these very large eddies, these circular features, cyclonic features that form within the Gulf Stream. These are typically around 100 kilometers or so in diameter. These are very much similar to cyclones in the atmosphere, in that they're the kind of weather systems of the ocean, if you like. So you have cyclonic eddies or anticyclonic eddies. But much like the weather systems in the atmosphere, the velocities associated with these eddies really increases relative to the background current, the average velocity of the current. More about that shortly. What you don't see in this image is the currents, the countercurrent coming in the opposite direction, because this is relatively deep. So this is North Atlantic deep water, which is flowing at water depths of a couple of kilometers here along the continental slope, in the opposite direction to the Gulf Stream, flowing southward along the slope towards the Caribbean. So we have a very dynamic system, and this all forms part of this great ocean conveyor belt that regulates our climate, that moves nutrients and heat around the ocean, etc. So you can think of it as a large set of convection cells in one sense, and it's really driven by two processes. The first process that drives particularly the surface currents is wind, and I'll discuss that in the next slide, how that works. And the second part of that is temperature and salinity contrasts that form naturally within the ocean. So perhaps the most significant of these is where these salinity contrasts are really set in place is at a very high latitude where we have deep water formation. You can see here deep water formation in these red dots, both in the Antarctic down here and the Arctic up in the north. And what happens here is that as salt or as fresh water is locked up in the glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic, and Strong surface winds cause evaporation of those waters. The salt's really concentrated, and that forms dense hyper or saline water that sinks, and it's cold water, of course, that sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and starts driving this whole convection system. So these two processes, in a way, I'm setting them up like they're separate processes here, and they do interact, of course. But I'm just going to give you a one-slide overview of how these processes affect currents in a little bit more detail. This is an image of the atmospheric circulation system. So on the left here is the wind-driven circulation system of the planet, centered on Indonesia. It took me a long time to find one of these images that really centered on Indonesia, but I eventually found one. And again, just to take you back to kind of basic atmospheric kind of science, we have the atmosphere is divided into these convection cells. So we have the Hadley cell at low latitude, the Ferrel cell at mid latitude, the polar cell at high latitude. And you can see what that circulation system looks like. If we focus on the arrows on the Hadley cell here on the left-hand image, you see that these are convecting. So we have wind moving away from the equator at high elevation and wind moving towards the equator at low elevation. So the surface winds near the equator are moving towards the equator and then deflecting in the northern hemisphere to the right and the southern hemisphere to the left because of the Coriolis force, the rotation of the Earth. And that sets up the easterly winds, which drive, which of course induce shear stress on the surface of the ocean and drive water in a westerly direction towards the west at the equator. So that's very much what drives, at a very high level, the surface currents at the equator. And you can see from the image on the right there showing the current mass, or it's actually a temperature map of the world's oceans, but you can see here the influence of that westerly movement of water has. As we get surface water piling up in the west of the Pacific, it then flows through the narrow gateways in Indonesia, and that is the Indonesian through flow into the Indian Ocean. So, and actually the image here is taken from a paper by Sankey Lee in 2015, which shows that those trade winds are increasing at the moment because of climate change, and that's driving an increase in the velocity of Indonesian through flow at the moment, and more transport of more heat into the Indian Ocean in relatively recent times. So that's a slight aside, but you can see that overall the process that drives the Indonesian through flow. And just to reiterate that point, that where we have continental land masses, they deflect these currents, they constrain the currents. In some cases, they accelerate the currents, and they cause it to when currents accelerate, of course, they become more, they're capable of transporting more sediment and even eroding sediment in some cases. So that's the wind-driven component of this system. And well, just to emphasize the impact that this isn't just restricted to the surface of the ocean, but that these currents the shear stresses on the surface of the ocean are actually also transmitted to the deeper ocean, primarily through the formation of these eddies that I mentioned earlier. So this is an image of some of the eddies again in the Kuroshio current offshore Japan. And on the right-hand side here, it shows the vertical structure of one of these eddies, and you can see that we don't just have these these closely spaced contours showing the pressure gradients at the surface, but that extends into the deep ocean. So we get elevated velocities associated with these eddies passing through that extend right to the surface of the seabed. And these are called the so-called benthic storm events, which are capable themselves of entraining and transporting sediments. Again, these are enhanced by gateways. Sometimes we have semi-permanent eddies set up where we have gateways, narrow gateways where ocean currents have to pass through. The other part of the great, the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt is this thermohaline component. And the important thing to keep in mind here, to remember here, is that as we get water with specific salinity and temperature, water masses with specific salinity and temperature set up in the ocean, they want to sink until they reach their equilibrium density. And then when they reach that equilibrium density, they move along slope. So we get contour parallel currents that form with different currents forming at different velocities, and those interact with the continental slope and deposits. And this is where the term contourites actually comes from. And the assumption is that most of these water masses are largely contour parallel. They're transporting sediment along slope, along the contours of the slope. You can see one very nice example of this: the upper, the contourite, the convex up mounded feature on the middle slope on the right-hand figure. If you can't see my mouse, I'm just going to see if I can. No, I can't get my laser here. You can see the large mounded feature on the continental slope, just below where it says UCDW in that image from Javier Hernandez Molina. So that's that contourite is forming just below the upper circumpolar deep water current, which flows along the continental slope here in Uruguay, where this image is taken from. So we have these wind-driven currents which induce turbulence and enhanced velocities in association with these eddies, and we have this vertical or horizontal stratification of the water masses and of the ocean, where different water masses are moving at different velocities, and we get, for example, waves forming at the boundaries between these water masses. So just like we have waves forming at the surface of the ocean, we also get waves and tides, internal waves, so-called internal waves and internal tides, forming at the density interfaces between different water masses. And they can also form significant turbulence and erosion. So these are the two kind of concepts to keep in mind when we think about the Makassar Strait data later on. It's also important to note that contourites have been historically associated with submarine landslides in certain settings. This example here is actually historic. A number of individual landslides. I can see my mouse here, including slide R and others below that. So the slope here is repeatedly failing, and it's failing in association with contourite deposits. You can see again these mounded features between some of these landslides, and these show us that there are contourites there. And what's happening specifically in this case is that the contourites are acting as weak layers, so they contain stratigraphically continuous sand and diatomite layers that have very little shear strength, and that when a small earthquake occurs, as happened here during deglaciation in particular, these are preferentially failing, and the whole of the slope sequence above that fails with it. So these have also been observed in the Mediterranean in association with some of these currents. This is an example from a paper that the same paper actually I showed you earlier, with the tsunami model was built from. This is an example where the water masses or the currents are predominantly vertical, if you like, it's one of these it's one of these fronts in the ocean, one of these jets in the ocean, where we have a strong surface current in association with strong eddies, and these erode, transport, and deposit sediment in one specific location, in this case on the continental slope of the Birdwood Bank to the south of the Falklands. So in this example, what we noticed was that all of the landslides were occurring in the same location, and it seemed like the current was acting as a conveyor belt, not just generally transporting sediment, but transporting it to a very specific location where there was a convergence zone in the current, and the current moved and deflected to the north. And when the velocities of the current decrease or move away from the continental slope, then they deposit their sediment, and they do so very rapidly. So you can see from this next image here, the final case study before we move to the Makassar Strait. This is a seismic line taken from the north slope of the Berdu Bank, where we have these landslides occurring very regularly. And we can see here again this Contourite drift. So we're looking really at this wedge of sediment that's forming on the middle to upper slope here. And it's forming, again, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here, I hope you can, but this feature here is it partly this convex up feature in its upper part. And it's been deposited very rapidly. We know from adjacent drifts, we haven't actually drilled this one, or nobody's drilled this one yet. It's deposited very rapidly, which generates excess pore pressures. It's relatively muddy for the most part. So again, that reduces the vertical permeability and enhances overpressure development. But there are likely to be within this weak sand and silt layers. At least that's what we see from the other drifts in this area. They're very laterally continuous and may act as failure planes. In addition to this, the current, which comes through you towards the screen here, with its core shown by these dashed lines here, is actually, so the current is what pushes sediment up against the slope here, but it's also eroding the slope, the base of the slope here. So you've got this this dual process going on here, which really enhances slope instability, or it makes the slope less stable, I should say, and it's eroding sediment from the lower slope, transporting it up the slope and depositing it on the upper slope and making it unstable. So all of these factors together, plus one other factor, which is that we have, and I've highlighted this here, the base of the gas hydrate stability zone here, which you can see from as this bright reflection, which is sub-parallel to the slope, extending up to the up to the seabed at about 300 or 400 meters below the sea surface. This is a bit of a controversial one. The role of hydrates in slope stability is an ongoing question that we haven't really answered yet, I think, to my knowledge at least, as a scientific community. There's still some major question marks about the influence of this. But the premise here is that as you change the temperature conditions, for example, in the deep ocean, that dissociates the hydrates, it changes these frozen methane hydrates and turns them into gas. And when you do that, then you destabilize the slope and you increase the pore pressure below the frozen hydrate layers. So that's the concept there. We're not going to talk about too much about that in the Makassar Strait. But the summary really here is that ocean currents, both the wind-driven currents, as in the case, primarily the case of the Falklands, and other water masses induced, set up by this Thermohaline circulation system, can substantially redistribute sediments along the continental slopes and preferentially deposit sediments in certain locations, but also precondition the slopes for failure. And that can significantly influence the location, the frequency, and the magnitude of submarine landslides. And as a consequence of that, the location, frequency, and magnitude of tsunamis potentially. We can see that they've had an influence in some cases, on historic tsunamigenic landslides, as in the case of Storega, in particular, in the North Atlantic events. And modeling certainly suggests that similar Contourite influenced prehistoric landslides may also be tsunamigenic. So that really takes us then to the third part of the talk, and the main part of the talk really, which is the Makassar Strait and Indonesia. So just to think first of all about the context in terms of tsunamis in Indonesia. This map here shows, particularly if you focus on the red and the yellow and the blue squares on this map, this shows the database of historic tsunamis in Indonesia going back over the last couple of hundred years. This is from the NGDC Natural Hazard Database, which is really a great tool for understanding natural hazards. And you can see that there have been numerous events, numerous tsunamis in Indonesia over the last few hundred years, as I'm sure you're much more aware than I am, of course. And what I've done here is highlight the ones that I showed in the slide earlier that have or may have a landslide mechanism in part here. So we have Krakatoa, probably Bali, Tambora, caused by major eruptions. Then we have a series of landslides, particularly in East Indonesia. So Flores, a couple of events in Flores, Lembata, Seram, number of events here that are, some of which at least are caused by submarine landslides. I should say that megathrust earthquakes are still forming the majority of the most dangerous tsunamis. Coach Aceh in 2004, offshore Sumatra, a number of others along that same trench. But there are several tsunamis here which are really quite anomalous and have fairly have some anomalous characteristics, either the very large wave height for the proposed mechanism, or they're very localized in their extent, etc. And then the two other events I've highlighted here are Krakatoa and Palu from 2018, where we had two relatively recent events that were not caused by large, or not only caused by large earthquakes. And those are shown here on the next slide. So Krakatoa, first of all, caused by, I think that was the mechanism in that case was fairly clear. We saw these images, incredible images before and after of Krakatoa, before and after the eruption in Krakatoa, where 2/3 of the exposed landmass of the island disappeared during that eruption, and a significant part of the submarine flank of the volcano also collapsed, and that's what caused the tsunami in that case. And my colleague David Tappan has been working extensively on that eruption, both the recent one and the 1883 tsunami. The other event which really made me write this proposal in the first place was Palu in 2018. That was a magnitude 7.5 earthquake with, again, a tsunami with quite unusual characteristics. It hit very quickly, quite high frequencies, and some other unusual characteristics that probably exceeded the, I'm not really sure about this, but probably exceeded the expectation of for tsunamis along that fault zone, and obviously a catastrophic impact, both the earthquake and the tsunami itself, in terms of fatalities and damage to the city of Palu. So that led me in 2018 to write this grant proposal, which was, and at that time the mechanism behind Palu was not really clearly explained. And my hypothesis was that this event could, or other similar events, could have been preconditioned by currents coming through the Makassar Strait. And this is a figure really shown from that first proposal, showing all of the earthquakes in Indonesia as blue dots, the main gateways of the Makassar through flow as yellow dots, and then the two recent tsunamis as red in the red stars. The hypothesis was there that the currents could act to destabilize the continental slopes of the Makassar Strait, making them prone to failure. So let's look at the Makassar Strait and what we've observed there and what's in that paper. So just then, as a reminder, the Makassar Strait is the main gateway. There are a number of other gateways, but it's the main gateway transporting water from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. So there are about 10 sverdrups of water flowing through here per year, slightly increased in recent years. That's 10 million cubic meters per second, if you don't know what a sverdrup is, which most people won't. So very significant volumes of water. And you can see here that where the current is enhanced in its velocity as it comes through the northern gateway into the North Makassar Basin, and then through the Labani Channel to the south, and then locally as well along the front of the Mahakam Delta. So the hypothesis here was that increased turbulence associated with this current as it went through these gateways, particularly in the north here in the Celebes Sea and in the Labani Channel, might be preconditioning the slopes for some of these historic landslides. That was the hypothesis, but more broadly, just to look at the impact on what the current is doing to sediments here. If we look at the velocities of the current in a bit more detail, you can see here this series of recordings of the current from the late 1990s and then into the 2000s and up to nearly the present day. This is from a 2019 paper. You can see what the current looks like in terms of its structure. And the average velocities are then plotted up here on the top. So the average velocity, you can see here that the current's actually very much, the velocities are very high near the surface. So we have current velocities of around 65 centimeters per second at water depths of about 100 meters. And then they're gradually decreasing until we have very low velocities below depths of about 500 meters below the sea surface. And if you think about the velocities you need to entrain sediment, erode and entrain sediment, that 10 to 20 centimeters per second is probably a good proxy for eroding and transporting silt-sized sediment. You can see here then what those velocities correspond to in terms of the temperature and salinity, or that is proxy for density structure of the currents. We can see that the highest velocities correspond to what is essentially the picnic line here. So where we have at about 100 meters, we have a sharp drop above that of salinity, and the salinities go from about 34.5, forget the units, parts per million, I guess, to 34, less than 34, 33.5 at the surface. So we have a sharp picnic line, sharp density interface at that kind of 100-meter mark, and then currents gradually getting weaker below that. Okay, so now the data that we used in this analysis, on the left here is the geophysical data that we used. So the polygons show you the multi-beam data, quite extensive multi-beam data that cover both the north and the south gateways, but not so much the continental slopes in the middle part of the North Makassar Basin. And then 2D seismic reflection data, quite sparse data that covers the whole of, more or less the whole of the North Makassar Basin. And then the other data that we used here was historic data from these various databases I mentioned earlier, including the USGS, the NOAA database, giving us locations of earthquakes, magnitudes of tsunami magnitude in terms of run-up, wave heights, etc. And you can see here that the tsunamis, the historic tsunamis, do cluster around these narrow gateways, but we have to remember that we have large faults there as well. So it's not to say, you know, the most likely explanation here is that these are caused by surface rupture of these faults. Right. So what did we see in that data? I'll first talk you through the multi-beam data, and I'm really only going to focus on one survey, and then I'll talk you through a bit more detail the seismic reflection data. So you can see here that the multi-beam data are really fantastic, high-resolution multi-beam data that allows us to see a lot of interesting features on the seafloor in terms of seafloor geomorphology. You can see here the surface expression of the Palu Coral Fault Zone extending in a north-northwest, south-southeast direction. Some various faults that are probably associated with that up in the north, up in the Celebes Sea. And then we can see the fold and thrust belt very clearly in the south. So deformation, active deformation associated with compressional tectonics. If we look in the northeast of the image, we can see a number of scarps of submarine landslides. So relatively small submarine landslides for the most part, probably a cubic kilometer of sediment or less that's been remobilized. So not at all to be discounted, and we need to maybe think about these events as well in the second phase of the project. But no large volume submarine landslides here, really relatively small events, particularly in this kind of region offshore Palu, where we were primarily interested at the time. So now looking at the seismic reflection data, And Rachel, when she did her mapping, really focused, as you can see on the line here, on the data above top of the Pliocene. So that's the yellow dashed line here. This line is a representative line extending from the Makassar Delta, or just to the south of the Mahakam Delta, sorry, in the west to the fold and thrust belt of Sulawesi in the east. And what we observed there is a series of very large mass transport deposits in the western part of the basin. So that was the thing that immediately stood out. We don't see these same large mass transport deposits in the eastern part of the basin. We see them primarily in the west. And initially, the assumption was that these are coming directly from the Mahakam Delta. We see these, where we have high sedimentation rates, front of large delta systems, these are relatively common. So Rachel did a more detailed analysis of the data and built a seismic facies map here, looking at different facies from pelagic, polygonally faulted sediment waves, turbidite aprons, mass transport deposits, Contourite drift, which I'll mention again shortly, and used those to create a facies map. And this is the map that she put together to explain the dynamics in terms of deep water sedimentation in the Makassar Strait in the present day. So we have, again, the fold and thrust belts in the eastern part of the basin, and largely pelagic sedimentation in the central part of the basin. And then these, again, just to bring your attention to these large submarine landslides in pale yellow here in the western part of the basin, the so-called MTDs, the mass transport deposits, which dominate the sediment flow in the west of the basin. And then some unusual terraces and drift features that I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time on the upper slope. Looking at the mass transport deposits in a little bit more detail, Rachel mapped out 19 of these individually, and there are more that aren't mapped. You can see here on the bottom slide that she has additional MTDs question mark at the base there. That's just because the imaging below some of the largest mass transport deposits is obscured, so we underrepresent the total number of landslide events here. You can see again from the kinematic indicators here, we can see extensional features in the up-dip portions of these in the western part of the basin. We can see compressional features in the eastern part of the basin. So they're all derived from the west. However, the thing that we noticed that surprised us a bit here was that the largest events were all skewed, weren't immediately in front of the delta, but were skewed substantially to the south. And you can see that from the color, this heat map of the landslides here, where the largest events, particularly this largest one in red here, 600 cubic kilometers, is well to the south of the delta front. And all the largest events here are really to the south of the delta front. We have other events to the north as well that are still significant, up to 100 cubic kilometers or so, but the largest are skewed to the south. And this gives us a kind of minimum frequency really for the events as well. So I mentioned this number of 160,000 years was in the abstract. I say minimum frequency because, of course, again, we're underrepresenting the total number of landslides. And there are smaller landslides that are below the resolution of our data. So that's something we want to think about in the next phase of the project. But in terms of why they're skewed to the south, let's look at a couple of lines along the upper slope of the Makassar Strait in the western margin in front of the Mahakam Delta, a bit to the south. And what we've done here is we're showing you here the seismic line in combination with the oceanographic data from a global oceanographic database, the ODV dataset. In the top line here, we show you temperature data. So we can see here that we have a thermocline that's close to that's the boundary where we go from a kind of peach color to red color and sharp decrease in temperatures. And the pycnocline, which is the density interface on the bottom line, which is more or less consistent with where we see that green color here, a sharp change in the salinities. And both of those correspond to the core of the current, which I've used the core of the current, we haven't got local measurements here, so the core of the current here is taken from the Labani Channel. And we can see here with velocities of about 60, 70 centimeters per second. If we remember the data from the Labani Channel, actually, during maximum velocity events, where the current locally or temporarily increased in velocity, that increases to about 1.2 meters per second. And in terms of the morphology of the slope, we can see that this core of the current really corresponds to this very sharp escarpment that forms corresponds to the edge of the shelf here. So we have an erosional scarp here at the shelf edge, and then we have this convex up slope morphology here, which we interpret as a plaster drift deposit in the upper slope, just below that erosional escarpment. In some cases, we have a more well-developed terrace, a Contourite terrace, that may represent, again, the erosion associated with internal waves or tides associated with the pycnocline at that density interface. So what we're seeing here, in conclusion, is that the Makassar through float, which again you can see here on the left of the image, is really acting as a conveyor belt, draining sediment from the front of the Mahakam Delta, transporting it to the south, and then where it's building up relatively rapidly and episodically being remobilized into deeper water as large submarine landslides. The largest of these events are occurring offshore between the delta and Balikpapan, I would say, so that we've shown that polygon here. We're not actually sure if these events carry on all the way down south to the embayment right down at the Paternoster Plateau here. Again, we don't have very much data in this area, so we're at the early stages in terms of the detailed work in this part of the basin. So where we see Contourite drifts forming actively, they're in front and just to the south of the Mahakam Delta. We've only got one or two lines further to the south, but across, going back through the entire Pleistocene, what we propose in this paper, and that's really what the paper focuses on, is that we have this conveyor belt transporting sediment to the south that's episodically failing, and that we need to understand more about this process to understand the present day risk. Of course, that was on the BBC. That was picked up by the BBC in March, I guess in April. Now the focus of the paper and really the BBC article again wasn't really about the future location of the Indonesian capital. That was mentioned in the context of the next phase of the study, where we're trying to understand more detail about the specific influence of the currents and the landslides in that part of the world. And we did seed this with as many caveats as we could when I spoke to the presenter to the reporter from the BBC. So we've got this comment from the article: the international team cautions against an overreaction. The reason we wanted to be emphatic about that is because at the moment these large landslides, frequency of these events is very low. It's once per 160,000 years. So when we're talking about large events in the North Atlantic that influence Scotland, where I live, we're talking about events that occur probably once or a couple of events every few thousand years, so much more frequent. At the moment, so far as we can see, the frequency is much lower in Makassar Strait. And also, we don't have a lot of data on the upper slope yet, so we don't know which areas, if any, are currently primed for failure. What we can say is statistically, over the last X number of million years, what the frequency is. Also, we haven't done the modeling yet, so we don't know if the landslides are definitely tsunamigenic, and we need to understand things like the critical threshold for the size, for depth, for water depths, and so on. So more data, and constrained modeling is required to really understand the specific hazards, or specific risks, time frame scales, etc., for the coastal communities between Balikpapan and Samarinda. So that really takes us to the next phase of the project. And this is something we're trying to do together with some other project partners from the Marine Geological Institute, the Geological Survey, more partners from Bandung, LIPI, University of 17th Augustus, 1945 from Surabaya, on more of the social science side and development side. What we're trying to do here is to try to get more. Of course, this project is now been significantly delayed or stalled largely because of the coronavirus crisis. So some of these elements are kind of stuck a bit. But what we want to do together with partners is to do some more detailed 3D seismic interpretation, multi-beam interpretation of the upper slope here between Samarinda, between the Mahakam Delta and the southern, the north of the Paternoster Plateau. We want to go to the field, but that's been delayed by a year, to look for any evidence of historic, not historic, but prehistoric tsunamis that might affect this area. That's the way that these events were identified in Scotland and other places. And then do detailed modeling constrained by these data sets, detailed modeling of the different landslides. So where we are at the moment with that is that the access to the data, the seismic data and the multi-beam data has been delayed. The field trip has been delayed. And so we are going ahead and doing some modeling, but at the moment we really need some extra data to constrain that. So that's where the project is now, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, but that's where it is. Some other outstanding questions as well that occur to us, maybe more generally about these kinds of events. What causes these? What is the trigger mechanism? Are most of these events occurring during particular climate states? Are they occurring when sea levels are higher or lower, or moving up or moving down? Are they linked to particular current states? Is when the current velocities are increased, do we get more sediment transport, more rapid accumulation of drifts? Does that precondition locally currents, or even lead to kind of spontaneous triggering of these events? And then there are broader questions to think about in terms of Makassar through flow and its relationship to climate change, its feedbacks with climate change, as it transports heat into the Southern Ocean, as the velocities change during the current Anthropocene. So much broader questions to think about. And the Makassar through flow is really such an important system for the global, for the global regulation of the global climate and the global oceans, that I think much more research needs to be done on that. And I'd be really interested if anybody's got any thoughts about possibilities of future research projects there. Just to acknowledge sponsors. So in terms of funding, this research is all sponsored by GCRF. The Global Challenges Research Fund, and some of the work in the Falklands particularly was sponsored by the Carnegie Institute. So I'm grateful for them for that initial funding. And those data sets on the left there are also sponsoring that Falklands data. But the ones on the right here from the USGS, NOAA, Multi-Client Geophysical, and TGS, it really wouldn't be possible to do this kind of work without those donation of these kinds of data sets. So I'm very grateful to them for that. And with that, I presume I open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Uisdean, for the excellent presentation. It's very interesting.
Yep, you're welcome. Thank you.
I hope you can get more support for the future research. Yeah, we have.
Yes, thank you.
We have already. Let me check. We have already 3 questionnaires. The first is from Ramadan Ibnu. Are you still there, Mr. Ramadan Ibnu?
Okay, hello.
Yeah, you can ask directly to Dr. Uisdean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, good. What can I say? Good morning, maybe, Dr. Uisdean Nicholson.
Yes.
It's already day here.
Yeah. Okay. So I have 2 questions regarding the submarine landslides. So from your slide, you mentioned the data. It means that can I get the database for spatial distribution of global submarine landslides based on your reference data? Is it possible to get the database on USGS or maybe on the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program?
Yeah, so, well, the databases for tsunamis and for earthquakes, which are the USGS and NGDC databases, are available from those sources. So you can get them directly there. I think we just imported them into ArcGIS and worked with them that way. There isn't, so at the moment we're compiling a database of submarine landslides and of tsunamis, and trying to, compiling things like their ages, their stratigraphic ages, their triggering mechanisms, their location in terms of tectonic settings. Those are linked to contourites and so on. So the postdoc is working in the next phase of this project, Kirsty Wright. I'm not sure if she's on the call, but she's been compiling that data, and at some point in the next few months we'll make that available. And there are a couple of other research groups that have similar databases. I mean, I can point you to some of those outside of this. I can't quite remember where they are at the moment, but I can certainly dig those out for you, and if you're interested in those databases.
Okay. So I have one more question, sir.
Yep.
Okay. So I just read the paper. It's all about the relation of earthquakes to seaflow, ground motion, and submarine slides. So they mention about the post-Miocene sedimentary basin in 5 km deep beneath on Los Angeles, and the co-author said that this is related to the free surface effects between rock and air, while for the seafloor it's often young sediment with velocity almost the same as velocity in water, or could be known as P waves. So what I mean is is it possible to submarine slides triggered by quakes whose closest rupture is more than 50 km or 100 more km away at the closest can trigger through by seismic waves?
Yeah, I think it's I mean, so the larger the magnitude, the earthquake, I guess the more likely it is to trigger events further away. So there is I can't remember the equation right now to calculate the impact in terms of the magnitude of the wave locally with increasing distance or radius from an earthquake. But it is. Yeah, I mean, if you have a magnitude 9 earthquake, what happened in Japan in the Tohoku 2011 event, my collaborator of mine, former collaborator of mine at least, Mickey Strasser, is now running an IAGI expedition there in next year, I think. And what happened during that event was that the whole continental slope shook so much that it almost shed its entire nepheloid layer, but also the shallow sediment. I think it was an average of a meter of sediment was removed from the entire continental slope of Honshu, pretty much it down into the trench. So it really depends on the magnitude of the earthquake. But yeah, 100 kilometers. If you have a large magnitude earthquake, something that's 100 kilometers away can be impacted. What's interesting in this case study here is that we don't have. There are a cluster of small earthquakes there. You can see on this slide here in Kalimantan, East Kalimantan, maximum about magnitude 5, 5.5, maybe 6 at a push. That are probably about 100 kilometers away, and then there are the Palikura fault zone is probably another 150 kilometers away, magnitude 7 earthquakes. But my assumption is that there's not going to be too much earthquake shaking in the middle of the Mahakam Basin. So again, the triggering mechanism here may be still just far field earthquake shaking that triggers these, or it may be that they're almost spontaneous and they've just reached a kind of critical stress state, and then just some small perturbation causes them to fail. But to understand that, I think we'd really need to understand the condition. mechanism.
Yes, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you
you're
very
welcome.
much indeed, Dr. Uisdean. And I'm extremely obliged to you. And good luck for your next phases project.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ibnu, for the nice question. Next, we will have Hanifah. Ibu Hanifah, please turn on your speaker.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sir Nicholson, for a very insightful presentation, very interesting. You mentioned that ocean current can be a precondition slope for failure, and that ocean current could be driven by contrast of wind, temperature, and salinity. And I would like to ask, is there any exact value at which those parameters could trigger a submarine landslide, which could later trigger a tsunami occurrence? I mean, you also mentioned about the mass transport deposit value that precondition the Makassar submarine landslide. And here I'm curious, is there any other parameters that could help us predict at which value condition we should be aware or alert that the submarine landslide triggered tsunami will likely happen? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so in terms of the first part of the question, particular current conditions that can trigger submarine landslides, I guess the critical thing with the current really is what the velocity is. So the velocity, the reason I talk a lot about the salinities and temperatures and so on is because it gives the structure of the ocean, and the velocities higher velocities tend to be associated with a certain part of the, certain water masses. And then the interfaces between them. But in terms of eroding sediment and then transporting it, for ballpark figures, you probably need 7 to 10 centimeters per second to erode clay, maybe 15 centimeters per second to erode and transport silt, and maybe 20, 25, 30 for sand. So if your current, so maybe you don't need constant velocities of that magnitude, but you need at least episodic velocities. So in the case of the Makassar Strait, that's really only happening in the upper few hundred meters of the water column. In the earlier case study I showed you from the Falklands, that's happening at 1.5, 2 kilometers water depth. So because the current conditions are very different. So it's really to do with the velocities. So I guess, I don't know about currents specifically triggering landslides. I do try to distinguish preconditioning from triggering, because I'm not sure if the currents actually are the final, the straw that finally breaks the camel's back. I don't know if that's an expression in Indonesia, but the final mechanism that just gives it the final push. I think probably it just sets up the boundary conditions, so you get very unstable sediment deposited in the slope, and then eventually some either earthquake shaking or even a storm passing by that can locally increase the pressure. If you have very elevated pore pressure and very little vertical effective stress within that sediment, then it will eventually fail. The other part of the question, in terms of critical threshold for landslides, that's what we're trying to do at the moment. Actually, when I did this first phase of the project, I was really focused on large landslides, partly because my background comes from seismic stratigraphy. So you only really see the biggest ones in seismic, where you can resolve the top and the base of the reflections. But I think that's something that we really need to understand in more detail, is really to have a kind of probabilistic understanding of what the thresholds are. I mean, and it will depend on things like water depth. So maybe if you're in very shallow water and you have 1 cubic kilometer of sediment that moves quickly, that will probably generate a very localized tsunami. If you're at 5 kilometers of water, 1 kilometer of sediment probably won't do any. 1 cubic kilometer of sediment probably won't make any difference. But I don't know that. That hasn't been done. We don't have the modeling to really constrain that yet. My assumption was always that you needed some tens of cubic kilometer sediment, but in the case of Papua New Guinea, for example, the landslide or the slump in that case was only 5 cubic kilometers, so it was not that big, but still created quite a very localized tsunami, but a very hazardous one. So I think it's really you know, I've struggled a bit with what to do. With, you know, I'm a scientist, so I'm trying to understand how and why things happen. But you know, in terms of translating that into impact and into how you know, should that be translated into policy? Like should governments have this on their risk register at this kind of frequency? Because in the UK, we don't really, we know these events occur every few thousand years. We know they cause tsunamis, but we don't really have it on our, we don't really have it on any kind of risk register. So as far as I'm aware, it's not really something that we actively try and mitigate against. So I think that's something I'm interested in thinking about more, how you translate that into maybe policy or what you do about this information, I guess. Thank you for the questions.
One more question, sir. How we could identify the recurrence interval of submarine landslides, maybe from your background, seismic stratigraphy? Is there any possibility to identify the recurrence interval of submarine landslides? I mean, related to the major gap.
Oh, to the time gap, yeah. I mean, the time gap in our understanding of the global. Yeah, well, I mean, that's just a case of the more people look, the more people study these things, and the more, you know, ideally you'd have there would be a global database. Somebody asked earlier about a global database. I think that would be fantastic to have a really robust global database with all these events, because not just the recurrence on average, but specifically when do they occur? Is it random? Is it, people speculated there was linked to climate state for a long time, but it doesn't seem to really fit the data. Seismic stratigraphers generally assume that they relate to sea level change, but again, it doesn't really fit the data. So I think recurrent, and I think it's just a matter of doing the detailed work. So what we're trying to do here is then take this to the next step and really document smaller landslides as well, and really really constrain the frequency of lots of different sizes of events. And then then it's a matter of doing that in different parts of the world. I would love to see this being replicated in Indonesia to get a kind of hazard map for all of the slopes of continental slopes of Indonesia.
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
thank you very much. Good to
thank
hear.
you, Bu Hanifa, for the questions. Next, we move to the next question is from Ibu Sri Budi Utami.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hugh Nicholson, for the fantastic talk. My name is Sri from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. I wonder if I may pass on a question from one of the PIs in my department, Adam Switzer. He is working on tsunamis. So the deposit seems to likely be low stand deposits based on stratigraphy presented. Is that true? And is anyone coring them? And my other question, oh, sorry,
yeah,
go on.
Okay, yeah. I'll answer that question then quickly first. We don't know actually if they're low stand deposits or not. The assumption, coming at this as a seismic stratigrapher, my assumption is that these are low stand or early transgression events. But that comes it's very model based, and it's very much based on the fact that I expect as a stratigrapher these to occur during those times. We don't have data to tell us if that's actually the case or not. We don't know. So, I mean, Storega, what a classic seismic stratigraphy model is that you get during the early stage of sea level fall, the early part of the low stand, I suppose, or falling stage systems track, that you suddenly kind of start to expose the shelf and the outer slope, and you remobilize and get large landslides. And then during the initial stage of sea level rise, during the initial transgression, that you might get a more mass transport because you warm the oceans, you destabilize hydrates, various mechanisms, you change pressure regime on the slope, and that causes failure again. But again, that's very model based, and it doesn't really fit the historic data that we have. On thing that we don't, most of the data we have isn't constrained well enough to say. And I think that's an open question at the moment, whether that is the case or not. It still makes sense intuitively, but I don't know if it is the case. Is anyone coring these? No, I would love to, I've thought of a couple of points about writing a larger grant proposal to do some sediment coring here, and we haven't done that yet, largely because it's just about finding the right funding source, because it's quite expensive, right, to get a marine survey and go and core some of these. So I'm still thinking about that, possibly the next phase again of the project after we've done this more detailed study. But I think it's absolutely important. I mean, that's in the case of Storega, that was critical. They they saw the tsunami deposits, they saw the landslides, but they actually had to date both sets of events to make a clear, unambiguous correlation between the two.
All right.
And I think even if we find tsunami deposits here, we won't know for sure that they're caused by landslides until we have that real good data. So I hope that answers the first part of your question, but feel free to elaborate.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And he also thinks the paper is pretty good. My other question is on the next step, which is on the numerical modeling for the landslides. It seems to me that the slope angle of the contourites is very important. I'm just wondering if that will factor into the numerical modeling, and if so, what kind of resolution are you looking at?
Yeah, so slope angle is critical. It controls obviously the rate at which it controls the initial acceleration. Well, that together with the actual parameters that impacts the model results. Slope angle is critical. Basically using the model that we use a model called FunWave TVD. So it is critical. There are very often, what you often have with these Contourites is that we have a convex up geometry, mounded geometry like this, and that the lower part of it is quite steep, and often you have erosion at the base of it, even where you have a moat. So the assumption is, in many cases, that it's a kind of retrogressive failure from the bottom up. In other cases, where we have very continuous weak layers within the whole Contourite drift, that if that layer becomes often have very little shear strength, and when those fail, that they can fail relatively instantaneously, at least over fairly large areas, and that you might get the whole, a significant part of that drift sliding in one movement. That's what we, by and large, that was where our kind of base case model was for a mid-sized landslide in Falklands. So you're right. I mean, modeling, you can model anything, and you can put any parameters into a model, and it's about really getting good constraints on these key physical parameters: steepness of the slope, the initial acceleration, the size of the initial movement, the water depth, and so on, is really, really critical to what you generate with the models.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know if I'm happy to discuss. I don't know if that's you work for a group that carries out these kinds of numerical models.
I can pass on your contact information, and I can tell them that you're interested. I think we have done, but yeah. I'm not. My background is not in landslide modeling, but yeah, I can pass on your interest to them.
Yeah, that'll be. I mean, I'm generally. I think the more groups that try to model it, because people often use different models and they have slightly different outcomes, and there's another group I think that are modeling modeling this as well at the moment in the UK. So I'm really interested to see what other people are doing, and we're some of the models, I think particularly the wave propagation models are quite well constrained. The wave generation propagation. The thing that's difficult to be sure of is what the landslide looks like when it initially fails, and that's where I think the most uncertainty is in the modeling, and that of course really controls the size of the wave and the propagation of the wave and so on. So I'm really interested in seeing what advances there are in terms of numerical modeling of landslides. I don't do the modeling myself. I've had I've had 3 postdocs now working on different modeling projects, both here and in the Falklands, and I don't do it myself. So the details of what's going into the modeling is it's really important, but I'm not the person to ask.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Bu Sri Budi Utami. Next question from Pak Kartiko Samudro, ya. Oke, silakan Pak.
Okay. Good afternoon, Pak Uisdean.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I have a question regarding the MTD in the western part of Makassar Straits. Do you think that the MTD is happen abruptly or very fast, or it is like a slow event, crawling and very slow?
So a great question. There are a couple of recent papers that have looked at other mass transport deposits in the greater region. There's one just down here in the Labani Channel, very recent paper by I think an Indonesian author who's working, maybe doing a PhD in London. Another paper looking at the South Makassar Basin with a very large, very thick mass transport deposit. And with that latter case, they actually, the rates they propose in the paper for the movement of failure movement in that case are extremely slow, centimeters per year. So it's really much more like creep process than a disintegrative translation or disintegrative landslide. So that event really stands out in our database as being quite anomalous in terms of its rate. And it's based on analogs in Hawaii where, slow creep on the seafloor has been observed. New Zealand, again, very slow creeping landslides. My feeling about those events is that they look quite different, that creep processes, you largely preserve the coherent structure of the deposit, internal structure of the deposit. They don't move too far from their source. In the cases that we have here, they look like they look like debris flows. Really, they're chaotic mass transport deposits with individual clasts and blocks that are sort of all over the place in every orientation. We don't know how far they've moved. Have they come from the upper slope? Have they come from the drifts? That's the hypothesis we set up in this paper. Or have they come from a little bit further down on the slope? Because we think they're debrides, I think they probably look more like for example, the event that we saw in Grand Banks in 1929. There's an initial slump that turns into kind of more like a debris flow, and then that eventually turns into a turbidity current further outboard. So then the rates, and it's a really, really critical question you ask, because the rate of movement is the most important control on what the if any tsunami results as a consequence of these.
Yes.
So it looks, in terms of its seismic facets and morphology, it looks similar to Storega and to the kind of Grand Banks. Well, I haven't seen the Grand Banks data, but it looks similar to Storega or these large landslides in the relatively recent prehistoric history of the Atlantic margin. So my feeling is that they're likely to be relatively fast, and of course that influences what the model outcomes are likely to be, and that's based on a lot of data from similar deposits, but very few of these are well constrained, and very few have been observed in real time. So that's really the caveat that we have to have. We haven't often seen these large types of debris flows that eventually turn into what are seismically resolvable mass transport deposits occurring in historic timescales. We've seen smaller slumps, ongoing creep processes and other things, but these much less so of these kinds of deposits. So it's an important question, and it's one that I say I give an answer. I think they're probably quite fast, and I think we have rates of some 10 couple of tens of centimeters of meters per second, but that's relatively poorly constrained still.
Yeah, because like you said that the fast or the slow of the deposit of mass transport deposit will be influenced the how big the tsunami will create.
Right.
And
exactly. Yep.
And another, it's not question actually. So my opinion, but it will be validated by your next step of study that regarding the modeling of a tsunami or modeling of effect of tsunami in the area. For me, as it is related with our new, like you said, that new capital of Indonesia that located around the Balikpapan, more to the west. If you see the position of the mass transport deposit in your picture and the position of the Balikpapan, you can see that the distance is quite long, around more than 150 kilometers. And then also in between Balikpapan and the MTD, you can see that there is a shelf. There is a shelf. So, I mean, but okay, this is a neat study, like you said, that if there is evidence of the tsunami in onshore or not, but my opinion, it will be small, if any, tsunami, because with 150 kilometers from the MTD, if there is a landslide or there is a slope until to Balikpapan area. So
so I think it really it depends on a few things. So I mean, if one of these very large events was to occur and it's fast, like we talked about, then I think, you know, the previous modeling of these kinds of events suggests that you would get a tsunami that probably would affect the local. So the red coastlines here, that was based on the red coastlines here are kind of showing broadly the areas that might be at risk of infrequent landslide, submarine landslide induced tsunamis, right? So quite a localized wave in a sense, because you tend to get a large wave in front and a slightly smaller but still large wave behind. The shelf doesn't really. The shelf doesn't, because they're occurring. They're not actually occurring where the landslide deposits are. We think the landslides originate on the upper slope, and so the shelf wouldn't really stop a tsunami per se. Shallow water would eventually, you know, it would slow it down, but it wouldn't stop it. So the tsunamis travel very fast in open water, and they slow down in shallower water, like any wave. It is a reasonable distance. I mean, if you had smaller events, let's say that which are probably a bit more likely, and we've got this quite steep escarpment, particularly here. Let's say if you had mass wasting of that escarpment in smaller events, then it may be the case that you get a very localized tsunami, which really just affects the area immediately around it and dissipates mostly by the time it reaches the coastline. That's possible. I don't know. We really have to do the modeling to find out. In terms of like, let's say Balikpapan, you've got about, you know, from that upper slope, then it's probably about 100 kilometers or a little bit less to the immediate coastline from the upper slope. In terms of the bay area, it really depends a lot on the orientation of the bay relative to tsunami. So the reason in Palu, the case in Palu was that the bay really focused the wave energy and probably increased locally the height of the tsunami. But then the tsunami generating mechanism formed right in front of the bay, or right in the bay. The earthquake was just to the north on the northern part of the Palikoro fault zone. So in that case, if you form if you have a mechanism that is perfectly aligned with that bay, then it will amplify the wave. But if you have, let's say you had an event occurring somewhere like near the center of that circle, you might actually that bay might be protected because of the spur of land in front of it, and the energy just can't diffract around that into the bay. So it may be the case that as we look at this in more detail, that the largest landslides are occurring, right in front of, so where we see the escarpments, the largest escarpments are south of the delta, but they're not right down near the Paternoster Plateau, but we have very little data there at the moment. So I think you're right actually to question that and to say, well, is it really going to affect that area? That wasn't really the focus of that first paper. It wasn't even really the focus of the, let's say, the BBC article. But I realize that it gets picked up by that, people, that draws attention, and then subsequently gets picked up by other media outlets, and they've really focused on that aspect of it. That wasn't really the emphasis of the first stage of the study, and it is part of what we're thinking about in the second stage of the study. But that's really an open question at the moment. Okay. And I think so. In terms of those caveats, I think it is important to be emphatic that these are very rare events, and that we really want to understand. And even if they happened in the past, it may not be set up at the moment for any immediate event for the next 500,000 or 200,000 years. In which case, it's really not a concern to anybody. So it's really about what the detail that have to follow this is looking at the morphology of the slope and looking to see how stressed that slope is, what the slope angles are, whether there are likely to be weak layers there, what the sedimentation rates are. So kind of thinking about the critical stress state of the slope. And it may be that there's really nothing along this whole coastline to be concerned about. It's just that on average over the Pliocene, there have been multiple events there. So I don't know if that answers your question fully. I think you're right to kind of question that, like the specific risks to specific places, or even the town of Balikpapan itself, for example. At the moment, we just don't know. We don't have enough data to say what the likely time frame or what the likely magnitude of an event would be.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay, Pak Uisdean.
Thank you.
That's okay, Pak Uisdean. I mean, when you have an update of your study in the second phase, maybe you can update us. So it will be very interesting, the topic.
Yeah. I'll be sure to do that somehow. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Kartiko. We have 2 more questioners. Next one is from Rangga. Pak Rangga. Silakan, Pak Rangga.
Hi, good morning, Uisdean.
Good morning.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have 2 questions, actually. So the first question, if we're talking about the future, with increased human population and human activity, which could then alter the material inputs into the shelf from the Mahakam Delta and maybe the Balikpapan estuary, which could alter the material inputs, maybe increase of anthropogenic materials, and which might also cause a redistribution of sediments into the continental shelf. Once it accumulates, do you think that can help facilitate the destabilization of the shelf and the slope, and could increase the frequency of future landslides? That's the first question. And the second question, seeing this map that's showing on the screen right now, that the materials, most of them come from the western side of the strait and then draining into the west. Do you think that Sulawesi would be more at risk of future tsunamis? I know that this warrants a further study by numerical modeling, but I just want to know your hypothesis about this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. So I guess the first question about the anthropogenic influence on slope stability, that's a really interesting one. And it's not just relevant to here, but many parts of the world. course, we know that a lot of the primary sediment source to this part of the Makassar Strait is the Mahakam Delta. I don't know if the Mahakam Delta is dammed, but you know, many large river systems across the world are dammed, and many large deltas are sinking as a consequence of that. So there's just not enough sediment getting onto the delta plains to sustain, to match the subsidence rates. I think that's an issue in Jakarta. I don't know if it's specifically damming, but certainly the subsidence is an issue. Does that influence submarine landslides? Well, so you reduce the sedimentation rate onto the outer shelf and onto the slope. So what you end up doing is that the delta plane over time would become, you get a kind of transgressive pattern or retrogradational stacking pattern in the delta. So the delta would step back and there would be less sediment supply to the outer slope. What that might do in this specific case is actually reduce sediment flux to the upper slope and reduce the long slope sediment transport by the current, and so potentially reduce. It might actually go the other way here. It might reduce the tendency to get these large events here. I'm speculating, of course. I think the timescales in which these, like that whole chain of processes, is quite a long time.
Yeah.
So you know, we're talking about probably many thousands, tens of thousands of years before that would be that would see an influence. I think in terms of other anthropogenic factors, I think what's more a significant influence here. Well, there are other things. So rainfall patterns are changing. That can change sediment flux. The current strength is changing here. I think I showed you that image which showed that there's about a 10% increase in the velocity of the Makassar through flow over the last. Well, there was a 10% increase between the 90s and the 2000s. So that means the velocities are probably increasing. So they may be eroding more, and that erosion might maybe more realistically on shorter time scales undercut some of the slopes and maybe cause slope stability issues. You know, not just locally in front of the Mahakam Delta, but in other places. So there are, and the water is getting warmer in the Makassar Strait and elsewhere in the world. Water masses are getting warmer, so seeing increased temperatures that can reduce thickness of methane hydrate layers, for example, and that may, again, controversial, but that may cause changes in slope stability. So there are lots of factors that we're only just starting to understand how they might influence stability. Question about sediment flux is a really good one, really interesting one. I don't think in this specific case that it would make that it would increase the susceptibility of the slope to failure. I don't think. But that's my feeling. Okay. That I would have to think through a bit more.
Yeah, sure.
On the second part of your question, on Sulawesi, the risk of hazards in Sulawesi. Indeed, we focused. I mentioned Samarinda and Balikpapan, and we mentioned those in the paper specifically because they're large towns that are adjacent to this area, and we know from modelling elsewhere that the largest waves in these kinds of events are immediately in front of the landslide and slightly lower amplitude wave propagating back towards the coastline behind the landslide. The wave is larger in front of the landslide because that's the direction of propagation. So you tend to get like a large kind of peak wave initially moving in front of it. So I think the likelihood is that the wave would be larger initially, the wave propagating towards Sulawesi, if there were such an event here, right? I'm speculating because I don't want like that soundbite to come out of this
no.
Out of context. If a wave occurred here and it propagated towards Sulawesi, that initially would be larger, but the distance is also longer to the coastline of Sulawesi.
That's true.
And so we haven't done the modeling yet. We don't know for sure, but our assumption is that they're probably broadly comparable. So initially larger wave, but longer distance to Sulawesi, shorter distance, but slightly smaller wave back towards Balikpapan and Samarinda, and probably comparable influence. The reason we mentioned, I think, specifically about Papua and Submarine in the paper is because they're large towns. We don't really, well, Palu is a large town. There are other large towns in Sulawesi, but not immediately along this stretch of the coastline. So that's why it was less of a focus. But yes, in principle, it would affect both coasts.
Okay, thank you for your answers. And also thank you again for the presentation. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you.
And a good weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Pak Rangga, for the question.
Thank you.
And then we have Pak Riza. This is the last question, yeah, from Pak Riza. Pak Riza, you can turn on your audio for asking the question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hello, Uisdean. This is Riza Rahardiawan from Marine Geological Institute in Bandung.
Hello.
Okay,
thanks for
very interesting your presentation because we don't have a lot of data like you, but more interesting about the landslide in southern Mahakam. Because in our data in southern Mahakam, we can see the submarine channel is not active, but in northern part is more active. But your presentation is landslide is dominant in southern Mahakam. Or maybe if you have access to petroleum industry in Indonesia, like Total Indonesia or any, you can see the structure in Mahakam Delta is more interesting to know what the landslide. And for next purpose, I think for the next support for your study, maybe you can use a 2D seismic high resolution. Is better for you and multi-beam data. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Riza, for the questions. Absolutely, absolutely right. The next phase of the project, we need better, and particularly 3D data, because then we have the bathymetry and we have the subsurface data. So we've requested 3D data sets from a number of different companies, and the initial request was back last year, and that was received favorably, but they need permission from the Indonesian government to release the data. So that's still in process, but it's been delayed because, presumably, partly because of coronavirus. I think everything shut down there for a while. So yeah, but you're right. You're absolutely right. We need that 3D data. I mean, you know, I appreciated the time I spent with you and colleagues last year, thinking about the shelf edge and the upper slope along the Mahakam Delta and to the south and to the north as well. I think having access and I mean, you know, Cecil Hadi is you know, one of the named project partners in this next phase of the project, and indeed MGI more widely are. I'm quite keen to work with you and colleagues there as well. So more than happy to follow up and to discuss it in more detail. The reason there's been a bit of a quiet this year so far is just because we haven't got the new data yet to really do the analysis and take this to the next step. But thanks for the question, and I appreciate your pointer there to look also to the north of the Mahakam Delta. So indeed, the data we're looking at that we would like to get extends all the way along the shelf, the upper slope, and the middle slope.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Riza. Good to see you.
Thank you, Riza. Thank you all for coming to this talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Uisdean. That will end our discussion. It's very, very nice discussion, very excellent discussions. As I mentioned before, we will put this talk into our YouTube channel. We also looking forward to your future research. I hope many people. I have noticed some people from government here, from research and government. I think it is nice to, if you would like to share your contact. Probably they want to have some discussions for the next research.
Yeah. I'm happy to share my. I don't know if I can share it through here, or if you can share.
I can put in the chat if it's okay. Yeah.
Great.
I can put your contact.
That would be great.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Ricky.
So people, we can contact you. I think there's some people at me already. They want to ask you some question privately. Yeah. Okay. Okay. On behalf of FOSI, we would like to thank you very much once again. I hope you have a very nice weekend, and I will give Melinda for time to close this session. Melinda. Yeah.
Thank you, Ricky.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, much Ricky. So we are at the end of this session. Thank you very much once again to Dr. Uisdean. this is very interesting question, and I think this research maybe can continue, and you can share again to FOSI maybe later on.
Yeah.
We're still waiting for the results.
Yeah.
And
Sounds
this
good.
will be very interesting presentation as well. We will upload to our YouTube channel later on. And see you again, Dr. Uisdean, and thank you very much to all participants.
Okay.
Bye, Uisdean. See you
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank you
everyone
very
for
much.
calling in. See you.
Bye, Jun.
Thank you, Pak Mino.
Bye.
Thank you, Pak Ben.
Yeah. Say regard to Richard.
Yes, I will pass them on, Ben. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for calling in. Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Cheerio. Goodbye.
Okay. Okay, I will end the meeting. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Cheerio. Bye.
Okay.
Okay. See you.
Okay,
Thank you
Mr.
very
Quick.
much. Thank you, Melinda.
Bye.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.